and welcome to Talks at Google. I'm Kavya Kasturi Rangan, and it's such a pleasure to welcome Dr. Stefano Puntoni to this chat. Dr. Puntoni teaches marketing at Wharton and is also the co director of AI at Wharton, an initiative to foster, coordinate, and promote research and teaching on AI across Wharton. Dr. Puntoni collaborated with Dr. Professor Bart DeLange to write a book titled Decision Driven Analytics Leveraging Human Intelligence to Unlock the Power of Data. The book and approach sits so squarely at the intersection of my day job that I almost wish I had this book available earlier in my career. The TLDR description of this book, which is going to be launched very, very soon, is as follows. Companies today have a lot more data available. We also have AI engines that are constantly improving and able to crunch the data for us. However, as organizations and decision makers, are we extracting the entire value that we can from these piles of data? In this conversation, we'll delve more into this topic and hopefully walk away with a better understanding of how we all can improve our decision making by using data the right way. With that, Dr. Puntoni, welcome to the talk. I'm so glad you're here. Let me begin by asking you. So, you argue about a shift from being data driven to being decision driven. That's sort of putting data at the back end of things. Can you elaborate on this for us? And can you tell us what the significance of this is?
Thanks, Kavya, for having me and for giving me the opportunity to tell you a little bit about our new book and some of the key ideas in it. I think you pointed one to the main one, this shift from being data-driven to being decision-driven. And so if you talk to people in business, I think over the past 5 to 10 years, one of the things that always pops up is the notion that organizations to be successful need to be data-driven, that their decision-making needs to be data-driven. And I don't think there's anyone out there that really disagrees that data should be used to improve decision making. And I think that companies have a lot of room for improvement, given the newly available technologies and data and everything else. But in the book, we point out that while it's a good goal to have, in practice, the way that data-driven decision-making is implemented is often actually getting to the way often of making the best possible decision with data. And in fact, can actually lead to making very bad decisions. And now you make them based on data, which might even boost your confidence in your bad decisions. So we argue in the book that the problem is really lying in the name, and that in the sense that the data-driven decision-making, it really puts this emphasis on the data as being the focal point of attention, and that this is what companies ought to be dedicated to understanding and building and improving and all that. And while it's important that we collect a lot of data and good data and that we have the infrastructure to do it, the reality is that the data just a means to an end, and that they are there to serve the organization to improve decision making. So what we argue in the book is that basically we have it upside down. It isn't the decision making that should be data driven. It is the data analytics that should be decision driven. They should be serving business objectives, and people should be focused on that rather than on data itself. And then trying to find a kind of a purpose for the data we have and see what we can do with it, rather than thinking what data do we need to make which decision.
That's in completely kind of, as you say, reversing the paradigm, kind of putting it the other way around. And um, do you feel like sort of organizations are doing it this way, or do you have an example that you could share with us, Stefano, and kind of like walk us through what do you mean when you say, "Hey, put the data at the back, like make the decision first, and then bring the data to support it." Could you walk us through an example?
So let's think first. Let's make the analogs. So the data-driven approach would say, let's invest in the data analytics, in the competences, in the infrastructure. Let's build our, data lakes, and then let's make it bigger and a data ocean or whatever. You can swim in it, and then let's figure out we must be able to do something useful with all of that. And what we argue is that to make good decision with data, you better deploy a process where you start from the decision, and by that we mean figure out what are the alternatives that may enable you to reach the business objective or relevance. And so figure out the courses of action. You may have 2 or 3, 4 options, whatever. And these are the things that we might be doing, and we don't know which one we should be doing because we don't have strong evidence to help us rank those courses of action. So now that we have a set of feasible alternatives that are going to have an impact on our key performance metrics, we say, okay, what kind of question can we ask which would help us rank these? How do we know essentially which one is the best one? And once we have that set of actions, we have the questions that we need to answer. Now we start thinking about the data and figuring out basically what is the data that is needed in order to answer that question. The job now goes on to the analyst to find the data, collect the data or whatever it is, analyze the data, and ultimately help us find an answer, which is where the process goes. But the point here is to say, well, actually, if you think about the process, the data analytics come in pretty late in the game. There's a lot of work that needs to be done before you even start crunching any number.
That's the and you I really enjoy the way you describe that in the book, where you say that start with the problem statement, right? Like, so what is the problem statement, and then you kind of use the data to back into it to explain which path or which solution path to that problem statement the data is asking you to take, right? So yes, absolutely agree. You also bring about a really interesting point in the book where you say that there are two sets of kind of responses to data, right? You could either you call them as people that dive right into the data, or they're people that kind of race to make the decision and then kind of ask the divers to sort of provide more clarity using the data. Could you explain that concept a bit, and also tell us where do you fall in that paradigm? Are you somewhere more on the diving side or on the racing side or somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah, so when we've been teaching and talking to companies about the decision-driven analytics, we tend to see this quite sharp divide between two different types of people. The people who are, intrigued by the data, they see it as a puzzle, they want to solve, they are excited about, opening spreadsheets and diving into making crosstabs, plotting things, and running models, all of that. And they get excited about it, and I think they are motivated by this understanding that in the absence of good evidence, it's difficult to make good decisions. And they also kind of a bit geeky maybe, and they like they enjoy spending time solving these puzzles. On the other hand, you have a different type of profile, which tends to be more like, what are we trying to do here, and how can we make the best possible decision, move on, because the clock is ticking, and they have limited resources, they have limited time, and they are focused on how do we make a difference. And so these profiles tend to orient towards decision makers and analysts, where the analysts are more like the divers and the decision makers, managers are more like the runners. And of course, this is a simplification. There are different types of people in every role, but I think by and large you observe this. And what we notice also in our experience, also running workshops, is that if you give people more complicated data, the difference between the two profiles becomes even starker, where the divers dip even deeper, and the manager will say, this is it's too complex, it takes too much time, let's push forward and let's try to make decisions and move on to the next one. And so in a way, what you observe is the kind of the environment in which companies make decisions today is becoming more and more complex, with more systems, more complex analytics, more data, bigger data, whatever, that this difference between analysts and decision makers is getting bigger, and the gap between the two becomes larger. And we think that this is really not helpful, because one result of this might be that managers feel, analytics is not for me. This is basically, you have these people, they take care of the analytics. All I need to know is to basically, have them do some work, and then they'll give me the answers. And that never works. It never works because the analysts, need a lot of guidance as to what it is that we're trying to do, and just to tell them find something in there is typically not a recipe for success. In fact, we argue that as the data become more complicated, as AI systems, for example, become more deeply, let's say, entrenched or enmeshed with the way that humans make decisions, we need managers and domain experts and those who are really on the front line of making those business decisions to get more involved, not less involved. Because I think now this gap is even large, and then you end up basically having all these massive investments being made, and the result might be that everybody's actually confused and not actually productively using data to improve the priorities that we have, but in fact might end up even answering the wrong questions or different things, or not being able to be productive and generative for the kind of things that we should be doing.
there's definitely no want for data now, right? Like I feel like there is more data than was ever available, and yet one would argue that that doesn't necessarily more data doesn't lead to better decision making, right? So I definitely agree with the perspective that you're sharing, and I also agree with the delineation that you're making between the two kinds of people and what they do with data. I guess the question then is that if somebody is sort of quantophobic, right, and they're not comfortable with diving right into the specifics of the data, how can they be more effective, especially as you mentioned, decision makers that have like they're short on time, they really don't want to get into all of the details. How would you suggest that they leverage those divers, and how do they leverage the data that they have available to make better decisions, to be more effective?
Yeah, so the book provides this framework, and I think the framework helps conceptualize the division of labor. But really, the job of managers and domain experts or decision makers is really that of formulating very good questions. And you need no data expertise to be doing that. And so, in fact, it's not a technical job at all. It's just a job of understanding what is it that could be undertaken in order to solve a problem, and what are the best courses of action that making that short list, and then figuring out how do I recognize good, how do I know which course of action is the best one, and so that's for the decision making to evaluate for the leader. And then now that I know that, then I can go to the analyst and let them do the magic. They will know what needs to be done now, given that you have a good question, a good set of actions that you might be considering. The problem is that oftentimes managers go to analysts and ask them in questions that are too vague. They are basically either impossible to answer with data. We've seen cases where you have like the manager asking the analyst, what should be our brand purpose? I mean, you can't expect an analyst to give an answer to that. Or are our customers engaged with our brand positioning, and what does that mean, and what are you going to do with the answer? So oftentimes the problem really lies there, that the managers is not thinking precisely enough about which decisions are being made, and what are the courses of action, and they basically go off maybe interfacing with the analyst in an entirely the wrong way because of it. And on the other hand, you have the analyst who now gets these fuzzy questions, which honestly is very difficult to know what they actually mean or what is supposed to be happening. And so they lack domain expertise, so they're not able to make that bridge and reinterpret this vague question in a more specific fashion. And so the whole effort might basically end up leading nowhere. And so let me ask you a question. Do you ever observe some kind of analytics projects that don't, either at Google or in client organizations that fail to deliver the results that were hoped for? Does it ever happen?
So what I have observed in my personal experience, Stefano, is that when we're faced with questions, I think more than fuzzy questions, I think there's a almost a predilection to go and expect the data to answer the question the way you have already assumed the answer to go, right? So there's sort of
Ah,
almost like a bias saying, and it's not overt, but I think there's sort of like you're assuming that we're going to take path A, and we're almost looking at the data selectively so that the data helps you arrive at, oh, right, so path A was the answer, right? So that's, I guess, the problem. Fuzzy questions, I don't think is as much of a problem in my limited worldview, because I feel like everybody that I interact with is very, very specific, and they understand the question, and I think everybody is in the details, right? Swimming in the exact same pool of details. Everybody's perspective is different, because I think people come at the problem statement from their vantage points. But I do feel that there is sometimes the tendency to want to use the data to explain a decision that we have already made, right?
yeah. So
Subconsciously.
that's something that we also talk in the book. We actually talk about that way of making decisions as a preference-driven analytics, which basically typically looks like the boss telling people go find the data that tells them right. you know,
Yeah, not even
Yeah,
would tell
you've probably
boss.
been in some of those meetings. And and that
Yeah.
is actually the worst way of using data for decision making, because basically now you're making a gut feeling kind of decision in the end, because you have a preconceived notion of what it should be. And what you're doing, that you're basically seeking evidence to confirm, to comfort you, to make you believe that you're right, or to give you a political tool in order to push forward and get people along. So now you have a veneer of objectivity, you have data that is supporting your preconceptions. So those preconceptions are more dangerous, in fact. So that's actually, and we all fall for this. It's the confirmation bias to some extent, right? So we are all prone to having favorites, and in a way that should be the job of the analyst too, who have maybe a little bit more distance from from the decision itself, to be able to stand back and say, we are going to subject those alternative courses of action to rigorous empirical evidence, and the outcome, you might not like the outcome, but in the hope is that we learn, and then by learning we can make better decisions. And sometimes obviously you'll be right, so there is a reason why people tend to believe things for a reason, so it's not like their beliefs are coming out of nowhere. So hopefully they will be mostly right, but I think it's important to have that separation between desire and data, where you don't let your wishes kind of interfere with analytics, either the way that you conduct analysis, or the way that you tweak the model so that it says whatever it is that you wanted to say. That's a very common problem, unfortunately.
So would you say that then the way to safeguard against sort of preferential decision making or preference based decision making, Stefano, would be to then ask open ended questions like what is my role as a decision maker then in that case? Like, so should I be asking questions that don't already explain or don't already outline the direction I'm intending to take? Is
So
that
you can think of it different ways, and I think probably organizations should undertake a number of steps to prevent preference-driven analytics from becoming the norm. Although I think it's very difficult to make sure that these wishes and desires never play a role in the analytics. It's hard to do, but I think there are a lot of things that we can do. First one is for decision makers, leaders, to have intellectual humility and realize that there's a lot that we don't know. So some of it is just attitude, and say, acknowledge the limitations of what we know, and even the limitation of what we can know, right? Which is probably uncomfortable sometimes. But that, I think, is going to put you in a better place eventually, because you'll be able to make better decisions that acknowledge uncertainty. Then be open-minded. So talk to people who have a different perspective from you. And this is actually, there are many reasons why diversity is important in organizations. But I think maybe the most important reason why diversity is important is because unless you have a diverse pool of people having input into which these decisions should be, what courses of action should we be considering, you get stuck thinking about the same things all the time. If you have only a bunch of people who think the same way, clearly they're going to come up with a very similar set of options, and nobody's going to think a little bit beyond that, where maybe there is a very interesting way of getting to the same place in a better, cheaper way, and that we haven't thought about it because we are all thinking the same way. So having this broad conversation, and then you need to narrow it down. You can't explore a million different options. There is only so many things that we can subject to empirical evidence, so you do need to prioritize. So that's a matter of judgment. So indeed, there you have to have some kind of sense, almost like in a Bayesian sense, for those who are into statistics, to think about a priori what seem to be the course of action that seem to be most promising because of past results, because of our experience, because of theory, whatever. But then when you go to the analysis, I think what we've been doing in social sciences is a transition towards something called pre-registration, which I think would be very useful also in a corporate domain, where you basically make an agreement up front about what it is that you're going to test, and how you're going to test it, and how you're going to judge success. And so it could be about the statistical analysis. For example, we're going to run this logistic regression model, and we're going to judge the best option by what's the most significant parameter in the model. Or we're going to run a cluster analysis, and we're going to, whatever it is the analysis ends up being, and the manager maybe doesn't even need to know that, but he needs to know what are the options that we're testing. And then the analyst will make an empirical plan, say, these are the data we're going to get, these are how we're going to be analyzing, and this is how we're going to determine the ranking. And then basically you stick to that script. You're basically committing to an analysis before you even seen the data. And so now the likelihood that you're gonna get your bias are gonna creep in and get you to run a lot of models and pick the one that makes your favorite option look best kind of goes away, or at least you have to make that explicit and say, I'm gonna ignore my analysis plan and do something different. But then it's quite clear what you're doing. So I think that's I think a very good way of pre-committing people and avoiding this kind of biases. And maybe genuine. It doesn't have to be about some kind of malign political game to make your option look better. It doesn't have to be anything like that. We are just prone to this kind of wishful thinking and try thing and convince ourselves a posteriori that this is what we wanted to do all along. So pre-register to kind of pre-commit, and then that's going to take care of it.
Yeah, and I find that very useful. So, sort of almost like outline your plan of action so that you're almost committed to sticking to that plan of action without actually getting distracted by your preconceptions, right? Yep, I like that.
Maybe
I'm
one
going.
thing to notice when I talk about this and say you basically decide in advance what are the courses of action, how are you going to know which one is the better one? What kind of a statistical analysis and data required to do that ranking? People often go back to me saying, well, but there's a lot of value in exploring the data. And now what you're telling me that we can't do any of that. And so just to add to what I just said, actually data exploration is very important. And we can learn a lot from freely exploring data, data mining, all of that. But it is important to be very clear that this is what it is that we're doing, right? So keep this, in science, you would say distinction between deduction and induction, and say, there's a lot of power for induction, bottom-up insights. I've had several research papers that came about, just observing an anomaly in the data and saying, this is interesting. Why are people doing this? And then that became a project itself. So you should be open to evidence that you did not expect and to learning just by looking at what's happening in the data. But that should be different from saying, I have 3 courses of action I need to take next week, and I don't know which one is the better one. And now we're going to subject it to empirical testing. And that's where we're going to do the pre-commitment device to make sure that we don't let our preference drive our analytics. But that it doesn't mean that we shouldn't just make the most of the data we have. It's just that you should be clear about what it is that you're doing right now when you look at data.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. I'm going to since we have a few minutes left, I think I want to pivot and cover a couple of other areas. Stefano, one was I really liked what you said about if you're going to be hyper. This is the other end of the spectrum, right? Like we're talking about fuzzy questions, and we're talking about not asking the right questions. To the other extreme, which is when you get hyper precise with the data and how it leads to incorrect decision making again. This, by the way, is a skill that I had learned about, which is when you want to convince someone, you kind of go hyper precise with the data, which is 78.2% of people say that this is the right choice, kind of right. It almost makes it look a lot more real than just saying 80% people think this is the right choice. So, but how would you kind of caution us when we're at the other end, like meaning that we're not using the data to convince, but we're kind of in our quest to find data. If we're going to go hyper precise, what should we guard against? What should we be careful of?
Yeah, I mean, hyper precise in what, right? That's the one question. I think we are often providing point estimates for things, like you said, 78.2, right? But I think it is important to keep always in mind that if you think about the nature of almost any natural phenomenon, it's really described by 2 parameters. One is a measure of position and one is a measure of dispersion. If you think about the normal distribution, you have a mean and you have a variance. Means alone are not sufficient to characterize a distribution of almost anything. So you always need both. You always need position and dispersion. And when you see business presentations, the dispersion part is usually completely out the window. You don't see it at all. And in fact, even introducing a range or some kind of measure of variance around an estimate is typically completely confusing and not very, not common. And so actually, that would be my advice. Maybe it's from a nerdy business professor, but saying always require when you're a manager and you're in a presentation, someone shows you some data, and you see some bar charts or some pie charts or line charts, whatever it is. Ask about what is the dispersion around these estimates. How much error is it? And so I'm a marketing professor, so people in marketing talk a lot about segmentation. And now we have these segments of customers. You have segment A and segment B. And we now take them as being this kind of like almost monolithic kind of groups of people who are supposed to think all the same way. And you see this all the time. So like generations or Gen Z are different from, the millennials or whatever. You make these wild overgeneralizations when in fact, when you look at the data, oftentimes the differences within a segment are actually much larger than the differences between the segments. And so if you're now using this very precise single kind of, we know there's no variances, they're all like that, 78.2, then basically you're already falling in this trap of losing complete nuance and potentially making very bad decisions and stereotyping people and simplifying things, and most of all, I think, failing to acknowledge uncertainty. A lot of the data that we collect are about events that we either cannot directly observe, so they're proxies for what we really care about, or they haven't occurred yet, and we make a prediction about the future. And so in these cases, obviously, there is an estimate, which is your best guess, but that is just a guess. So you always need to qualify that with a range and say, okay, there is, sales are going to be X within this new product we're going to launch next year. But, they could be, X divided 10, or it could be X multiplied 10. And all of that is kind of possible given our understanding of the uncertainty. And you're going to make different decisions when you think that way compared to when it's X for sure. So a crucial, I think, dimension of making good decision with data is always to understand uncertainty. And this is something that companies often fail to do well, I think.
Yeah, this is very, very thought-provoking. And I like what you said about making sure that when you're asking for, when you're looking at the data, to ask for dispersion around sort of the number that we're clustering on, right? Like, so what is it that the dispersion looks like, so that you can understand how much of variance is there, and it reduces the oversimplification.
A game we do sometimes in class is just to plot a scatter plot with some observations across X, Y axis. Very simple. And you basically generate data with a correlation of 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, or whatever. And then you show a correlation that looks very strong, and people say, oh, you make very strong decisions. When you look at the actual scatter plot, they're all over the place. And say, wow, this is a 0.6 correlation. Okay, it's not exactly all on a line. I mean, it's all over. And so you start realizing just how much noise there is in the world.
Yeah. We just have a couple of minutes left, Stefano. So I'm going to ask you one last question, and then if there's any other insights, then I would like to kind of leave that for our audience to read in your book directly, and not kind of give them the whole TLDR right here in this conversation. So I guess one last question, and this is, I'm going to again pivot. This is related to the AI field, which you are also involved in at Wharton. With the advent of AI, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, that we have so much more advanced capability to ingest data, to kind of make sense of that data, and to kind of almost instantaneously kind of spit out decision making. How do you see the role of decision makers, right? So how do you expect a decision maker to leverage that AI piece so that they're making better decisions, right? So what is your, I guess, advice, or what's
to me, as a professor and as a person who is interested in teaching and doing research, to me it's quite clear that over the last 2 to 5 years, partly because as we moved to generative AI, but partly because of other things, AI has ceased to be only a technical subject. It's not only a matter for computer science. It's become a social science question. So as these algorithms become deployed through society, they get disseminated in organizations, decision support systems, predictive analytics models, obviously now generative AI applications of any kind, then the big question to me becomes, what do people do with it, and what do you think of it, and how do you integrate this to make good decisions? And one big, I think, bigger picture element of the book is that we ought to deploy the system so that they complement human expertise and human intelligence. That's the whole point of the diver and the runner, to say you have domain experts. They understand a lot of things about the world. It took them a year to gain this expertise. How do we make the most of it? And in partnership with analysts and data. And I think so. Our book is providing this, quite simple conceptual model for thinking about that. But I think it's a broader question for society overall to think about how do we develop analytics and AI systems that are complementing human expertise and capitalizing on that, rather than see them more as a matter of replacement for human expertise and human intelligence. I think that complementarity between human and machine, I think, is what is going to propel organizations forward. So thank you very much for having me. I think it's been a pleasure to be able to tell you a little bit about the work we've done, and I look forward to interactions. Reach out on LinkedIn or follow our work at the AI Wharton, and thank you for having me.
No, absolutely, Stefano. Thank you. And one last question: when is the book going to be available, and where can our audience go and get the book from?
It's going to come out on May 14, and it's going to be available on all your platform where you buy books.
Where you get it. Where you get it. Awesome. Thank you for your time today, and I really, really appreciate the conversation. You've definitely given us something to think about, and I'll remember decision making first and data second, right? So thank you for that, Stefano. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you all on the next edition of Talks at Google. Bye bye now.